Welcome back to another Stormy Water session. We missed last week, as you will have noticed if you're an avid fan, and we have been doing a sort of 3-episode thing, which we do want to carry on with, and we will carry on with in the future, but due to certain constraints on us, I think you're going to get one long one or one full length episode this week, due to the fact that I won't really have time to put them all up separately and edit them separately. Part of the whole thing is that we're going to put them out on Mondays, probably Monday, Wednesday, Friday, although just Monday this week, and that's because we want to do as little possible sort of work, as it were, on a Sunday, which is actually the subject of our episodes today. So we're going to talk about work today, and it's funny because we tried to record this on Friday, and about this far into our recording, my phone rang and I had to do about another 2 hours worth of work when I thought I'd finished. So just briefly hand over or ask my dad how he is, really. How are you?
Yeah, I'm all right. Yes, I've been really adjusting my workload over the last couple of weeks, and you begin to feel the benefit of it in terms of your own sort of physical, emotional sort of capabilities, really. So yeah, and my football team won the other day after being 2-1 down. So, good things are happening.
Good stuff. So in light of, last week, I think, last week's episode didn't happen basically because we had too much actual work to do. But I think the first question is, sort of biblical context. Why work? Like, can't we just sort of?
Well, there's 4 answers to that question, and none of them are wrong. But 3 of them sort of miss the point. They're kind of byproducts, not the main reason. So one of the reasons that people sometimes say they work is to earn the money to support their family. And that's not a bad thing. A responsible, wise people will work in order to make sure that they're fed, their family are fed, roof over their head. Nothing wrong with that. But it's not the whole story. And then other people say, well, I work because I need to support my family, but also I want to share my faith with my fellow workers. And that pulls on the Christian heartstrings, because you think that's great. They want to witness about Jesus to the. But actually, that's not the reason that we work. And there's a lot more places where we can sort of share who Jesus is than just the workplace. And if we're sort of running around at work buttonholing people and saying, can I just talk to you about your spiritual state? We'll very soon get a lot of grief off of people and a quick chat with the manager. So although there is often conversations at work about people's faith and their life and their lifestyle, it's not, and that's a good thing. That's not the reason that we go to work. Another reason that people say that they work is that they want to influence their workplace, and that has a lot of things going for it. Sometimes it's good to not want to dominate our workplace with our religious worldview, but to influence it by our behaviour and our example. And that's not a good thing. That's not a bad motive for being at work. But I would want to say to us that our primary reason for working is that it's part of our, what some people would call our vocational mandate. The theologian N.T. Wright talks about this quite a lot, and that we all have a vocational mandate, not just people who are church leaders or well-known worship musicians or Christian writers or whatever, the sort of heroic figures that we sometimes look to, but that all of us have the opportunity to be somebody who brings Jesus to their work situation. And what we actually mean by that goes back to Genesis 2, verse 15, where we're encouraged to be stewards of creation. And so the reason that we work is for the benefit of our family, our tribe, our clan, our district, our nation, and the world. And that we're contributing to its cohesiveness and its hanging together, and people being fed, and bridges being built, and roads being maintained, and that there is a fabric to our society and our culture, and our work contributes to that in a multiplicity of ways. And within those contexts, we have a unique opportunity to not just say, why don't you believe what I believe, but actually to model what we believe. I had a friend in Paris who was a manager of a very big pharmaceutical company to do with the law side. And when she went in, she started asking the staff what they thought about the strategy for a particular way forward, and could they do a short presentation, and all of these things. And the staff were really taken aback. But eventually, some of them talked to her and they said, the person that was in the job before was extremely dictatorial and shouted at you if you got anything wrong. It was a climate of fear, and you have taken seriously our training, our background, our qualifications. And so she was stewarding that team, taking people's dignity seriously, taking people's skills seriously. So quite apart from what she might ever have said about her faith and her deeper beliefs, she was modeling something and seeking to bring a good outcome. Take, for instance, if you're an architect, you can design things that really enhance the built environment that people live in, give them places to rest, or give them places to enjoy the view, or give them places to congregate, meet up with their friends. You can do things to do with the light and the sense of well-being in an area. And so everything that we can do can enhance people's experience of life. And so being stewards of creation is not just to do with ecology, it's to do with how we are in the choices that we make about how we spend our time and spend our life. And everything else then falls in behind it. Of course, we may earn some money that we can use to bless the church and look after the family. Of course, we might be an influence in that place just on various individuals. Of course, we might be able to, at some point, share with people quite directly about who we are and what we believe. But our primary reason for being there is to be stewards of creation. And it's not a massive task, but it's a thing of beauty to think that we're not just kind of, oh, I really wish I didn't have to do that, but I've got to earn the money. And we're actually thinking, you know, I was watching Countryfile yesterday, and these people out on the marshes trying to improve the habitat so that a certain kind of moth flourishes, because it's an important part of the biodiversity and the eco, you know, whatever. It's not just a job. It's a way of thinking about life and looking at life and how they view where they're
easier to think that when you're doing a job like that. I suppose there might be some people that think, oh, my job, you know, nobody needs to do this job, you know.
Yeah.
But,
well, it's interesting. I go to Sainsbury's quite often, and there are some staff that are what I would call the connectors. They chat to the customers. They have a little bit of a joke with them. They enhance that customer's experience, which rumbles on way beyond, oh, I've got my groceries and that chat was very nice to me. If that chat's very nice to them and somebody else is gentle with them and so on, it begins to impact their whole view of life. And so there is no job that, you know, we have an allotment project and there's one or two people that are deeply adverse to worms, all that kind of stuff. But they're great at welcoming people. And they are as valuable as the ones who are raising the money, digging the ground up and putting the plants in, and all that kind of stuff. And we need to value everybody for the contribution that they make, however apparently menial it might seem.
So one of the sort of main elephant in the room at the moment, I suppose, is the pandemic and how that's impacted upon people's jobs, and sometimes their job going, or they're being furloughed, or they're just not sure what's going to happen. Am I going to keep it? Is it going to go next year? Brexit as well. There's all sorts of stuff going on. So, I mean, I've written here. I think some also correct things gone on, but it says, how has pandemic impact working future? But how do we make sense of that?
On the face of it, obviously, there could be a lot of unemployment for a while. Every time there's an economic stagnation, it seems to eventually recover.
And so some people, just before you go on there, maybe just sort of, because your answer might be in light of this, but some people will say, well, if you don't have a job, that's a moral failure on your part.
Yeah.
Or some people might say, well, it's a moral failure on the government's part.
Yeah. I think that plays back into personal responsibility and systematic damage to people. And some church people will always go back to personal responsibility and say, well, you lost your job. And you say, well, it was the pandemic, the bottom fell out of the hospitality market or whatever. Well, yeah, no, but. And then you say, the Bible recognizes the possibility of systematic failure. And they said, no, it doesn't, and they deny it. But actually, the Bible does recognize the possibility of systematic failure. It encourages the people to leave the gleanings at the side of the field, recognizing that there will be poor or indebted people in the society. And our job is not to shrug them off. It's to give them the means to quietly harvest that material and maintain their dignity. There's a provision for the forgiveness of debt after 7 years so that people can return to the economy. There's a recognition, particularly in the minor prophets, Amos, Hosea, and Micah, that people are behaving towards the poor in ways that are an affront to the character of God and his heart and his desire for people. It says, you've got dishonest weights, you're selling the poor for a pair of sandals. And so we need to recognize that some people find themselves in difficulty and unable to access the workplace, not because they're in some way not trying. There's a book called The Myth of the Undeserving Poor, written by Natalie Williams and somebody else. And I'd really encourage church people listening to our podcast here to go.
Or even not church people, if you're listening or watching. And I think that book is part of a trio of books, and I think none of them are particularly, well, it depends on the circumstances, but they're not wildly expensive, and I think they're taken best as all three of them.
But this is a lady in a local church here in England where we live, tackling this issue and seeking to look to the big patterns of the past to say, I mean, the other thing is purely from a sociological point of view, when you analyse unemployment figures, about 50% of it's transitory at the best of times. There's another big chunk that it's going to be 6 months at the most. And then you boil it right down, and a tiny percentage of the population are long-term ill, and they're not going to get back into the workplace. And so, say the figure's 3 million, you end up with 300,000 of that 3 million that are unemployed who are actually a bit work shy. But even then, you have to ask, what was the life circumstance that these people came up with? Did it involve a lot of trauma? Do they have substance abuse issues? Why have they got
maybe like concentration problems and that sort of
yeah. So
I think
it doesn't do to be glib about why people aren't in the workplace.
And somewhere like, I don't know, London, for a certain person, say someone my age, if I was in London, there'd probably always be something I could do, like, even if I did that for a week and then I did this for a week. But there's areas of the country where, and one of the things in the 80s was, well, if there's no work in your area, just, get on your bike and go to another area. But that's not an option. Sometimes people have got family in this area, or one of the things that was sort of controversial about 5 years ago was a whole estate in London being demolished and redeveloped, but being redeveloped quite slowly, such that the council had to get the people out, but they needed to send them somewhere else entirely. And a lot of them they tried to send to Birmingham or Hastings and somewhere else up north that I can't remember. But the mums, it was a lot of single mums on that estate, and they were saying, well, look, my mum lives in London, and if I'm to work, which the government wants me to do, I need to be in London so that my mum can look after my kids. And if they send me to Hastings, then I can't work.
Yeah. And I think, that when Norman Tebbit said, get on your bike, it was one of the most profoundly unchristian things that a Tory politician's ever said, because a lot of the fabric of your life, as you've just pointed out, relates to familial connections or school connections or community connections that have grown over decades. I talked to a couple of people who'd gone off to university and came back eventually. They didn't settle. And part of what they said was, here in town, I knew everybody, a large chunk of people my own age. Then you're suddenly amongst strangers with no collective memory, no trust from previous encounters. You're lost in another culture. And so to say to people, leave this area, go up there, sometimes the brute reality, as we know, is that people have to migrate because they're going to die, or there is appalling poverty where they are. But it's not the ideal situation for many people. And when it comes to work, remaining, if it's at all possible, in an area where you have long-term social connection, because the social connection is part of the fabric of what makes us well and settled, and whatever varying degrees of happiness we have. It relates to the people that we know, the trust we feel, the security that we have. So often in the 80s, they would subsidize places to remain open because it was cheaper than letting the steelworks or whatever it was close and supporting the social services and unemployment benefit bill,
which is the
result.
Potentially what the furlough has been for the last 9 months, where a lot of these things would have just gone to the wall. And all right, they might have been able to start up again in a year's time or whatever, but there would have been like 8 million people unemployed or something.
Yeah. So part of the answer is the things that you've identified to do with retirement, retraining, restoration.
The 4 R's, which I hadn't actually mentioned yet, but so I mean, for some people, there has been redundancy. The furlough went so far and no further for some people. So that might involve retraining. For some people, it might be, oh, well, I was only a few years from retiring anyway, so that's the best option for me. But just this whole sense in all of those things of renewal and what, the biblical perspective on that is.
Well, I think once again, we would be bringing our value system to bear. And so let's take some of them. Retirement. For many people, the time comes either because they reach state pension or they have their own savings plan that begins to pay out, that they retire. And in the midst of the pandemics, as you've pointed out, some people will accelerate that. But a lot of people do not cope very well with it because the whole structure of their life, the rhythm of their life was, get up, go to the workplace, banter with the lads, do the stuff, holiday in Tenerife, they had a rhythm in their day, their weeks, their months, their years. And that begins to dissipate and they have a lot of time to themselves. And for men particularly, there is a deficit quite often of male company. And so I would encourage people to think about being intentional if they're retiring as to how they're going to use their time.
Yeah.
If I was to retire today, I would do less. I'm not as physically, on fire as I used to be, but I wouldn't do nothing. I would have a day where I volunteered and a day where I read and a day where I I would want to say
a thing last week where it basically said that particularly men, whether they're married or not, but particularly if they're not married, when they retire, they just sort of retreat from society, basically. Like they're just like, oh well, okay, I haven't got any friends anymore.
Yeah. Yeah.
and they don't really, they obviously it's different for different people, and it's probably not that they're seeing nobody, but for some of them, it is almost that stark.
Well, many of them, they have to find another workplace or something. So for some people, it's the golf club or the bowls club, and that's how they put rhythm in their week, and that's where they find male and female company. But I would say to people that we weren't created to do nothing and sit around with our thoughts. And so this intentionality, which is often talked about in terms of divide your week up into 21, morning, evening, morning, day, afternoon, evening type arrangement. Make sure that for several of those, you're doing nothing, reading the paper, reading a book, watching the telly, going out for a walk. But think about how you want to utilize those other slots and kind of don't set yourself a rule, but set yourself a kind of, would it be good if, one of the things about volunteering, you don't do it because you're lonely or because you pity people. You do it so that you're engaged in a rhythm of what I would call this vocational contribution that we talked about earlier. Sometimes it's not volunteering to help run a charity shop. It's volunteering to work in an allotment project or whatever it might be. And people can find a helpful outlet there that plays into their rhythm of life. And from a Christian point of view, I would encourage people to think, well, my intense working life is over, but what is my vocational contribution to culture, society, family, home, church over this next little while? And the human connection in that vocational work is vitally important to people's physical, emotional, and mental health. And I would encourage people to go for that. Another thing that you mentioned was retraining. And I think that speaks to something slightly different, in as much as that we can reach a stage of our life where a door shuts. I had a friend and he'd been deeply engaged in a particular area of retail for 25 years. And he was made redundant. And for a while, he was just sort of sitting there scratching his head. Then he took up some new stuff. And then he sent a bottle of champagne to his boss, former boss, saying, I know it can't have been easy for you. It wasn't easy for me. But actually, I'm having the time of my life in the new thing. And so it comes back to this thing about your identity is not in your work and working for a particular group of people, although it can be hard sometimes to leave those things. It's in your vocational path. And if a particular door shuts, you will usually go through a process of grieving and mourning, and then your head will come up and you'll say, well, is there something that I've always wanted to do? Is there another place that I can contribute? I know somebody who eventually left had been extremely influential in Christian bookselling, and then did a project that failed, and then started a massive project in Africa to establish community foundations in a particular village, which has taken it from barely food sufficient to food sufficient, hospital, agricultural practices that are meaning that they are self-sustaining, and a man who'd had the success he had, you'd think, oh dear, that can't be, it must be really stressful, that 20 or 30 years of his life ending. But the contribution of the next 20 years of his life has been incredible. And he's had to train himself, the nuances of aid and development and all those things,
In lots of ways, much more enriching, if not financially, but sort of spiritually.
Yeah. And it requires some humility as well, I think, if you have to retrain, part of you's thinking, what if I'm not good at it? What if, and surely I, but actually the discipline of learning new things, and then you discover actually you're excellent at something that you didn't think you could even grasp. I mean, it's a bit like footballers, when you get to 35, you're either going to set yourself up in business with all the money that you've earned, or a lot of them say, well, I've got a skill here, why don't I retrain? They do their UEFA badges, and so they're still contributing to the same type of workplace, but from a different angle, and they're still involved in the hurly-burly of it all.
It used to be that the higher, I think some of the lower earning ones would still get it at this point, but they'd get their pension, start getting their pension at 35.
Yeah.
And that's changed to 55 because they were sort of, just they needed to have another job basically, and the reliance of getting the pension at such a young age was not great.
They could get a bit lost.
Yeah.
Plenty of discretionary income, but nothing to occupy their mind.
Yeah.
So retirement, intentional, vocational, but not quite at the same intensity. Retraining, a little bit of humility. Maybe I can learn something new. Not easy. There's always going to be grieving and mourning in the middle of these processes, and it's no good just saying, let's have a positive mental attitude and we can climb out of this. It's positive mental attitude and not pretending that actually there isn't some sorrow in it all, and that it's all right to acknowledge both of those things in the midst of it all. And there was what were the 4 R's again? Restoration,
so redundancy, retraining, retiring, and renewal.
Right, the redundancy thing. I was made redundant in 2008, and
the day before my birthday.
Yeah, there you go. And the blow was softened considerably by the fact that I didn't really have to worry about money for 3 to 4, 5, 6 months. But then you think, I'm just past my sell-by date here. What am I actually going to do? And so redundancy can be one of the hardest knocks. But many of the principles that we've applied to the previous scenarios still count. That redundancy will often lead to retraining. Redundancy may precipitate early retirement because you can. But if you're going to early retire, you need to be intentional on your use of time and your contribution. But for some, it's a source of great sorrow. I've never quite earned the same amount of money since I was made redundant. The market moves on. And so you have to come to terms with that. And be honest in your conversations with yourself. You know, what expectations might I have that might need to be lowered in terms of property, type of holiday, you know, all those kind of things. There's a room for pragmatism in the middle of redundancy. This is not my perfect job, but I will do it for 2 or 3 years while I find my way back.
And you might also think, well, actually, the job that I was made redundant from was not ideal. Like it was making me really stressed out or something. So on some level, obviously, it's all relative. But you might think, well, I'm going to be happy to earn £5,000 less if I've got 20% less stress or something.
Yeah, that's one of the other things about the impact of pandemic on the workplace. Some people miss the social aspect of being in the workplace. Other people are finding the reduction in travel time and having 2 to 3 extra hours a day around the family, but being almost as productive 4 days a week and then traveling to the central office the other day a week. And they're finding that very helpful. And some, if I was a property, commercial property developer around certain parts of London, like Croydon, I would be slightly beside myself, because if people aren't going to have 15-floor offices anymore because the vast majority of the workplace will work from home and then they'll come to a central hub for a weekly meeting, you know, but what will that do to people's quality of life? If you think to yourself, well, I can do that job in London, so I just need to make sure I can get there in 2 hours by train 1 day a week. So I'm going to live in the Cotswolds, or
Leicester, yeah.
I'm going to live in a smaller city, or, you know. So some of these things are a bit uncallable, but they're predictable, if you see what I mean. You say, well, that might happen. But that plays back into what your aspirations in life are. I need this job because otherwise I won't be able to earn the money to buy the whatever. But the place where I live, it's really hard to buy those kind of places anyway. So I'm going to have to commute, but the commute means I hardly ever see the kids. Some of this distance working with weekly check-ins could lead to much greater personal work-life balance and enrich the family. And it could be a real positive thing. The mundaneness of the family, taking the kids to the park, all of these kind of things, they're quite profound in the child's life and the adult's life. And when they get pushed out, the child might live in an affluent household, but not be emotionally affluent because his parents are so distracted, or her parents. So all of this kind of workplace stuff, it plays into our understanding of the whole of life. You know, I think the popular term today is intersectional, but intersectional is much more than issues to do with feminism. It's intersectionality is the story of how our values fit in and influence, negatively or positively, every sphere of our culture and our society, and the environment around which we live. Parts of London are changing, not because the poor are moving out and the rich are moving in, but because, although there's elements of that, but because people are taking their own immediate area much more seriously. They want to protect the places where they live as places of beauty, and, you know, they want to protect their parks. They want to make sure there are leisure facilities, all of those kind of things. So, yeah.
Right. Yeah. Well, before you upset any more second wave feminists with your intersectionality, and also because we're just going to do a shorter one this week in any case, for various reasons. Hopefully we'll be able to maybe record one next Monday afternoon or something. I'm away from Tuesday to Sunday this week, but hopefully we'll put one out next Monday. But before we close, should we close with the Lord's Prayer?
Yep. Our Father, which art in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses as we forgive others. Lead us through the time of trial and temptation. For thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory. Amen.
Amen. And deliver us from evil as well.
So, oh yes, yeah. Well, that was the time of trial.
Right, okay.
That's the way it's interpreted in some interpretations.
Yeah, I thought that was not into temptation. Yeah.
Just going back to the intersectional thing, I'm not negating the second wave feminists interpretation. I'm just saying you can take that template.
I was having some fun with you there.
Well, yes, I know, but in case people thought I was some kind of misogynistic, whatever.
Well, intersectionality is still feminism, so it's just a different. Anyway, a bit off the point.
For those of you that would love to wrestle with some of the complexities, at some future point, Ben and I will have a discussion about the male, female, men, women debate within the church and in the wider society.
It might be really good, in all seriousness, if we get a woman on to talk that as well. Cool. Okay. Right. So, well, see you next week, hopefully, everyone.
Thank you, everybody. I hope it's provoked you, stretched your thinking.